Italy took a sharp turn to the far right in its elections.
Italians have chosen their first far-right wing government since World War II.
The rise of the far right in Sweden. The Sweden Democrats, a party with neo-Nazi roots, become the country's second biggest.
Hello and welcome to the Nexus. There are big changes happening in Italy and Sweden, with both countries voting for right-wing governments this month. On today's programme, we're going to be asking just how right-wing are they? Are they just conservative, or are we talking about the far right? We'll also be looking at their policies. What changes are they planning to make, especially when it comes to legal and illegal immigration? And finally, we'll be looking at who's next. In other words, will we see right-wing governments taking over elsewhere in Europe? We'll get to all of that in a moment, but first, for those of you still asking who are they, here's a quick introduction.
Good morning, everyone. I am Giorgia Meloni. I am 45 years old and I am the president of Fratelli d'Italia, the political party of Italian conservatives.
Italy's Giorgia Meloni and Sweden's Jimmie Akesson, two European politicians whose time has come.
Just nu har vi 20,7.
They're populists, traditionalists, right-wing. Their critics, though, go even further and suggest that these two are the new faces of Europe's far right. But is that fair?
Italy about to see the country's most right-wing government since World War II.
The most far-right government since the Second World War.
First far-right leader since Mussolini.
Meloni, a working-class political outsider who will be Italy's first female prime minister, campaigned under the motto
Difenderemo Dio, patria e famiglia!
Her party, Brothers of Italy, will be the leading force in a right-wing coalition government, which includes veteran leaders Silvio Berlusconi and Matteo Salvini. Akesson's slogan, "Sweden will be great again," is equally patriotic, if a little unoriginal. And just like Meloni, his political bedfellows are all right-wing, including the oddly named moderates. And the similarities don't stop there. They clearly come from a similar political background.
Maybe it will be a success. I hope so, of course, but we don't know yet.
Both their parties can trace their roots to the far right. A direct line can be drawn between the Brothers of Italy and Benito Mussolini's National Fascist Party. Its logo and flags carry the same flame-like emblem that is on the former dictator's tomb. And the slogan, "God, Country and Family," was used by the fascists back in the 1930s.
With the historical flame of the old party.
Similarly, the founding members of the Sweden Democrats were neo-Nazis and white nationalists. However, both have worked to distance themselves from those early extremist links and have publicly condemned Nazism.
The Italian right has handed fascism over history for decades now.
International journalists differ, though, in their coverage. Sky News' Adam Parsons, who interviewed Meloni, writes, "Giorgia Meloni is not a fascist. Yes, the logo of her party is a hangover from its fascist origins. And yes, the teenage Ms. Meloni once expressed her admiration for Mussolini's leadership qualities. But no, she's not a fascist, a word that gets thrown around far too carelessly." Another British journalist, Piers Morgan, would agree.
I wouldn't categorise her as far right at all. I would call her a fiscal conservative.
However, the left-leaning Guardian newspaper published a different view. The election of Italy's fascist-adjacent Giorgia Meloni is a public reminder that women can be just as awful as men. The party's policies may or may not be far-right, but they are indisputably conservative and right-wing. Both take a hard line on immigration, especially illegal immigration. Meloni and other right-wingers point to the fact that around 750,000 migrants have illegally entered Italy by sea alone since 2014.
What Italy should do is to stop boats leaving from Africa.
Akesson takes a similar line and wants to make Swedish immigration laws the toughest in Europe. Since 2015, Sweden has taken in more migrants per capita than any other European country, and at the same time, violent crime has risen dramatically. Gun crime is rising faster in Sweden than anywhere else in Europe, and gun deaths are 2.5 times more common in Sweden than the European average. There have been over 300 shootings so far this year, and 47 were fatal. As of 2017, there were so many bombings that Sweden made it a new category of crime. With the exception of Mexico, Sweden is the only country on Earth that monitors the use of hand grenades. As you could probably guess, both Meloni and Akesson like to talk about being tough on crime. They're also both Eurosceptics, and they both talk about traditional family values. Their policies may appear unfashionable, but both have seen a huge surge in support over recent years. In 2010, Sweden Democrats only managed 5.7% of the vote. By this year, they were the second biggest party with over 20%. For the Brothers of Italy, the surge has been even more impressive. In 2018, they took just 4.4% of the vote. By 2022, just 4 years later, that had risen to over 26%, propelling Meloni to power. And that's probably the major difference between these two political leaders. Akesson will not be Prime Minister in his country because there are just simply not enough political parties willing to work with him in a coalition government. However, his party, being the second biggest in Sweden's parliament, means that anyone who wants to run the country will need his backing, leaving the Sweden Democrats the kingmakers. Meloni, though, well, she will become a world leader, and her message is:
there is nobody all over the world who needs to be afraid from us.
Well, should we be afraid or not? Let's ask our guest now. And we have Ylenja Lucaselli. She is a member of the Brothers of Italy party in Rome, who knows Giorgia Meloni personally. Nadia Urbinati is an Italian political theorist at Columbia University in New York. Jim Stenman is a Swedish journalist whose mother went to Sweden as a refugee from Ethiopia. And Pieter Cleppe is the editor of the Brussels Report, an online publication reporting on all things EU. Ylenja, if I may start with you. Let's start off with that reassurance from Giorgia Meloni. No one needs to be afraid. Why does she feel the need to say that?
Well, because the storytelling that was given outside our country about us was wrong. Everybody was talking about far right and fascism and Mussolini, and that is not what we are. So it's very important for us that it's clear inside and outside Italy who we are, which is conservative. And that doesn't mean to be far right. That only means that we want our country to be a leader in Europe again.
I think you're absolutely right in that the mainstream media generally has labelled your party far right and have done their best, I would say, to scare people. In fact, they even say outright, you ought to be worried. Now, let's look at the evidence that they present, okay? We'll start with this interview that Meloni gave to the Washington Post, right? She accuses left-wing politicians of financing, quotation marks, an invasion to replace Italians with immigrants. Does she stand by that? Does your party stand by that?
Well, you know, immigration in Italy is a huge problem that other countries in Europe are now facing as us. We are the door of Mediterranean, and a lot of immigrants arrive here even without having the rights to be on our country. And Europe didn't help us until now. So that is something that we need to care about, and we need to be focused on that, because we need to help our families to grow. We want everybody has the laws to be in our country. We don't want...
Does your party actually believe, though, that left-wing politicians, it is their intention to replace Italians with immigrants?
Well, what we know is that they don't care what happened to these people when they arrive in our country. We saw that because every day arrive a lot of people, and then they just want people here to do the work that Italians don't want to do anymore. And we don't want that. That is not right for people that arrive and for Italians. So there's a lot of issues about that.
She proposed a naval blockade to prevent boats arriving from North Africa. Is that still the party's policy?
Yeah, but we need to understand well what we mean when we say blocco navale. We want to start a relationship with all the countries where these people come from, and then with that relationship try to stop and help only the people that have the rights to be here to arrive in our country.
Human rights campaigners will say that everyone has the right to seek out a better life, and if they need to get through Italy to do it, that is their right. Address that one, but also this. Naval interventions, interventions at sea can be risky. Very overcrowded boats, they can capsize. So if you could just deal with those two questions for me.
Well, first of all, yes, of course, everybody has the right to have a better life. What we think is that everybody needs to have a better life in his own country. So we need to help those people to have a better life where they born near their families and friends. So we don't want people just to take a small boat and
come in,
risk
Nadia.
their life.
Nadia just wants to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is truly the sign of an intolerance and very dangerous position. There are many Italians in the United States. They were born in Italy, like me and others, and they traveled around and they decide to change their country. I don't understand why the Italians occupy their own countries in a way that they don't want anybody else to come. It is absurd. As it is absurd. Don't interrupt me, as I didn't you. It is absurd.
You didn't interrupt
me. No, you didn't. I did not interrupt you. And you do the same.
Go ahead.
So
go
show
ahead
that you are tolerant.
Give you my answer.
So
go ahead.
She also didn't answer your question, because when Meloni said that the left is paying countries to send the immigrants to Italy, this is a declaration. This is a fact. She said so. So answer to this question. Does the left pay countries in Africa or Middle East so that they send their own people to Italy? Can you answer this question?
Of course I can, because she didn't say that. No.
Answer this question.
Let me answer. I'm answering you. If you try to listen what I'm saying, I'm trying to answer you if you want to listen, but that's, your way to talk, it's more far right than mine. So, okay, so let's put in the perspective. So when she was talking about the left party, the far left parties that pay, was not saying that they pay countries, but they pay the people that bring immigrant on a boat to bring them here. And that is a fact, and is there's no way to say that is not true, because that is a fact.
Ylenja,
but let me tell you another thing, just another thing. I'm a wife, and my husband is American, and my child were born in United States. For me, and I was a wife of an American, and to go there and have my child born there, I have to go through a lot of controls. And I'm an Italian. I didn't want to work there. I have my job here. I have my business here. I have my families here. So that was just to give the birth there. And I was for 6 months under the United States control to be sure that I was returning back to Italy. So when you talk about United States and Italian that are there, you need to be sure that you are talking about different things from immigrant that came from South Africa. So those things are not compared.
Nadia, did you want to riposte?
No, I mean, there is no discussion. This is a personal reason, absolutely destitute of any justification. I don't know what to say. For me, the question of immigration is a real issue that we are really unable to deal with, and for many other reasons. For instance, the number of people who around the world are paying conditions of exploitation and difficulty of life, and they have to look sometimes to leave their country in order to survive. This is a real issue, and we cannot solve by claiming that the Italians should close in order to be more protected from others, and thus to be more
everybody wants
Italian.
Arrive
this doesn't mean
Italy,
anything.
the rest
it means
Europe.
Zero, nothing. I would like to understand
you
what does it
should
mean
know
for
Europe
the European
better.
Union to have a country that is ready to accept the idea that not all human beings are equal, and some of them can be left to die on the Mediterranean Sea, as the naval bloc is to do so. So, I mean, they are very issues. They are simple issues. They are not personal issues. They are political issues. Having said so, I don't think Meloni is dangerous for one basic reason, because we are in Europe and the European Union is supporting a situation that doesn't allow to first use the budget in a very irresponsible way, as the many governments have been until now in my country. And we have a huge debt to be paid back, and so we cannot play games here. And second, because from the point of view of the alliance, the NATO alliance, we can count on the support. So
okay, let me take it over to Brussels. You mentioned
yes,
Europe.
Brussels.
You mentioned Europe acting as a moderating force. Pieter Cleppe.
Yes.
We've heard the president of Pieter Cleppe. We've heard the president of the European Commission, von der Leyen, saying, well, possibly alluding to Italy, but talking certainly about Hungary and Poland. If a country gets out of line, gets out of the European Union line, we have tools. What does she mean by that?
So she was clearly referring to the new rule of law instrument, as it has been called, which allows, or which is basically another toolbox for EU member states to restrict the number of EU funds flowing to a certain member state when that particular member state is to be found in breach of the rule of law standards. It was probably not very wise to sort of state that so in the manner she did just before the election. This clearly helped the anti-establishment forces in Italy. Now, of course, at the end of the day, Italy is an important member state. It looks like Meloni is building bridges. Like today, there was a newspaper report that she was having a deal with Mario Draghi. Also, so let's see what happens. We have this whole discussion: is she far right? Is she not? I mean, at least according to the former Prime Minister of Italy, Matteo Renzi, who's a social democrat, who's an opponent of Meloni, he says there is no danger whatsoever of fascism in Italy. Let's not forget that we had, in the past in Italy, we had politicians like Gianfranco Fini that also emerged from the post-fascist movement and that became very respectable center-right politicians. So I would say the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
That's a great saying. And I'd like to stay on that subject about whether or not the brothers of Italy are far right. Let's have a listen to an American network, just a very brief soundbite here, in which I think it is Mehdi Hassan is warning about the far right and all the links to Benito Mussolini and so on. Let's have a listen.
I want to start today by talking about a politician on the right who we should all be worried about, who's on the rise today. A politician who has brushed off accusations of fascism while dabbling in the Great Replacement theory. A politician who wants, quote, secure borders because of dangerous Muslim immigrants, who has minimized the threat from COVID and cast doubt on COVID vaccines, and who wants a return to the traditional family free from the influence of so-called LGBTQ lobbies and the evil influence of Disney. No, I'm not talking about Donald Trump or Marjorie Taylor Greene or even Ron DeSantis. I'm talking about Giorgia Meloni. Giorgia who? Giorgia Meloni, leader of the far-right Brothers of Italy party.
Nadia, you're a political science professor. Please help us out with this definition. The newspapers, the TV programs are all going with far-right quite happily. Would you define the Brothers of Italy led government as, or to be, as far-right?
Yeah, I would be very careful because these are categories to be used with the cautious, and we need to have data, knowledge, and also the definition is very ambiguous. So instead of using these generic categories, let's try to understand first what they're going to do and what they can do, because we live in constitutional democracies, and our constitutional democracies after World War II showed to be very strong and capable of containing limitation or limitation of power. And so this is important. They don't, even if we have right-wing, very far right-wing and violent people, as we did, because we had several demonstrations in the last 10 years of the growing up of these movements. But first, they are not in parliament. Second, the parliamentary democracy is the best system to contain violence and to contain also unlimited power. So we have to be importantly attentive to define the right wing within a parliamentary structure or within a constitutional structure. Is another story than simply talking about far right.
Well, we're running out of time, so let's go over to, to look at Sweden anyway. And Jim, I needed to ask you about your excellently written article. I don't recognize Sweden anymore. You're an interesting fellow because your mother came to Sweden in the 80s, I believe, from Ethiopia, and you feel very Swedish yourself. But clearly, immigration numbers have gotten to such a level there that you're writing an article that says, I don't recognize the country anymore. What do you mean by that?
So it's a combination of the fact that Sweden has welcomed a massive number of immigrants, but also the fact that the country has failed when it comes to its integration policies, not just for the last couple of years, but for decades. And that's why I believe that we're seeing this rise in the Sweden Democrats and that they're going to play a huge role in the upcoming government.
Jim, do you fear them, the Swedish Democrats? And what about minority communities? Do they have anything to fear from them?
I think recent immigrants that have arrived in Sweden in the last couple of years that might still be in the process of, sorting out their permanent residency, acquiring citizenship, I think they probably have a bigger reason to fear the Sweden Democrats because I think the policies are going to be much tougher going forward in terms of obtaining the right to live in Sweden permanently. In terms of myself, I don't really fear them because the Sweden Democrats are going to be part of a center-right coalition government. Yes, they are Sweden's second largest party and they got roughly 20% of votes, but they can't govern the country without other parties involved. So sure, if they had a majority, if they were governing the country on their own, I think the situation would be very different. Now, having said that, this upcoming government that's currently in formation, I mean, there's no question about it. The policies of the Sweden Democrats, especially when it comes to integration and immigration and tackling of crime, they're going to be hugely influential.
Look, a final question about Sweden before we move back to Pieter Cleppe. Previous governments who have presented themselves as more centrist, if you like, I mean, they haven't really done immigrants a hell of a lot of favours either, have they? Unemployment amongst children of foreign-born parents or foreign-born Swedes is something like 4 times that of native Swedes, and crime is getting completely out of hand in such areas. Do you think that any good can come of having a right-wing coalition governing Sweden?
Well, I mean, I think the argument would be that it can't really get anything worse at this point because, as I said, we've seen decades of failed integration policies. So maybe this is an opportunity to try something new. And as I say, it's not going to be the Sweden Democrats running the country on their own. They're going to be doing so very much alongside a center-right coalition. So Sweden is a social democrat country. They've been governing the country on and off for decades now, but it's clear that their policies haven't worked. And if 20% of the population has voted for the Sweden Democrats, then I think it's really important that they're given the opportunity to govern because we're a democracy at the end of the day.
Pieter Cleppe, we got to the final question we posed at the beginning of the programme. We said, will other European countries follow and take on right-wing governments or even far-right governments? What do you think?
Well, I do think that you see across Europe discontent with sort of the economic policy management. Still, people vote for parties, the right-wing parties you mentioned that often do not really have very different economic policies than the social democratic policies that have brought us where we are. However, typically these anti-establishment forces, they have different solutions for migration. They want to outsource asylum processing, which Denmark is doing, which the United Kingdom is doing as well. And secondly, typically also they want to end the energy experiments, the experiments with our energy supply in Europe. We have a massive energy crisis. because fossil fuels in Europe were phased out, while we were still importing fossil fuels from elsewhere in the world, from Russia, from Qatar. There was these massive subsidies for renewable energy. Nuclear plants were being phased out. So I do think that's an important element that we should not overlook, that we will probably go back to normal when it comes to energy policy. And this is something that is also driven by these anti-establishment forces.
Very interesting point. Pieter Cleppe, thank you so much. Nadia Urbinati, Ylenja Lucaselli, and Jim Stenman. Thank you all very much for your contributions to the Nexus today. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Until next week then, goodbye.